Welcome back to Are You Smarter Than a Libertarian? We have a great episode for you today. Let's get on with it. All right, let's play a quick little game since everyone loves to play games and games are played all around us. When the government says, we're going to war, who exactly is we? It's you. It's your neighbor. It is the guy trying to afford groceries and gas at the same damn time. But it's not me. I've already done my time. Or the we is the same political class that hasn't balanced the budget since dial-up internet. Today, we're talking about one of the most influential libertarian thinkers on war and foreign policy, Murray Rothbard. And Rothbard had a pretty radical idea for the time, and it's still pretty radical now, but it makes the most sense logically. War is rarely about protecting you. That's true. It is usually about protecting the state. A great example is the Armenian genocide. The state of the Ottoman Empire wanted to stay in power, so that's why it happened. Now let's break it down. The world is basically in giant political anarchy. Rothbard pointed something out that political scientists across the spectrum agree on, whether you're a libertarian or a communist or a socialist, whatever. There is no world government, and there should never be a world government. And you keep listening to this, and you'll see why. Each country has its own state that monopolizes violence inside its borders, police, courts, military, the whole kit and caboodle package. But internationally, there is no superstate running the planet. You have UN, World Health Organization, World Trade Organization trying to do this, but if no one listens to them, they have no enforcement power. Now, so what does that mean that there's no superstate running the planet? It means the global system is technically anarchic. Not the Mad Max sense, but in the literal sense. There is no central authority above the individual states. You have certain superstates like the EU, but the states still have some control within the EU. States interact with each other the same way rival gangs do in neighborhoods where no one is really in charge. Sometimes you have cooperation and you have peace. Sometimes they threaten each other, and sometimes you have turf wars. In gangs, it's over drugs, territory, and money. And in the real world, it ain't much different except replace drugs with political power. Rothbard argues that violence shows up so often in international politics because the main actors are states, and states are institutions built on coercion. You can't prove it otherwise. That's not exactly a recipe for peaceful conflict resolution. Now let's get into the next part. Governments aren't the people. Here's where Rothbard really starts poking the political hornet's nest, and I agree with it. He rejected the idea that the government equals the people. The government does not equal the people. The government equals the government. I don't know how else to put it to you. In his view, and many other libertarian views, states are controlled by a small ruling elite, and that's what the left says. There's a small ruling elite. And that even applies in democracies, which is huge, because we would like to think it doesn't apply to us, but it does. Yes, you vote. Yes, there are elections in a democracy. Yes, there are speeches about the will of the people. It is political theater and propaganda, but most Americans buy it hook, line, and sinker, whether you're on the right or the left. But the machinery of the state is still run by a relatively small class of political insiders, which Thomas Jefferson warned about the House of Representatives becoming an elite club, which it is. Now, these political insiders are politicians, bureaucrats, defense contractors, intelligence agencies, and all the other alphabet mafia agencies. DEA, ATF, all of them. And Rothbard argued this elite has incentives that are very different from yours and mine. Because here's the thing, the state does not produce wealth. I don't know how many times we have to tell you this, old man. The state does not produce wealth. It extracts wealth through taxation and burdensome regulation. Meaning, the people who run the system benefit from maintaining it. They don't benefit from making it more egalitarian, allowing small businesses to compete. That's not what it's about. And that group of people, they shape how foreign policy works. And here's the thing, states care about one thing above all. And what is that? The same thing every human should care about if they're sane: self preservation. If the state collapses, the ruling class loses power, influence, and access to resources, which is tax money and revenue. So governments are extremely sensitive about two threats and two threats only: defeat by another state, that's one, that's the top one, and revolution at home. In my opinion, the reason the Armenian genocide happened is because you were worried about people in your territory who weren't aligned with you becoming a fourth column. Rothbard explained this in his famous essay, The Anatomy of the State. War and revolution are the two biggest dangers to any state's survival. So, what does a state do when stuff starts to get a little out of hand? It mobilizes people with propaganda. And this propaganda says, we've heard this before, we're defending freedom, we're protecting democracy. That's a lot of the war on terror. We're fighting for our way of life. That's predominantly World War II, Korea, and Vietnam. But Rothbard argues the reality is often reversed. Wow, that's an interesting concept. It's flipped. Citizens are not primarily defending themselves. They are defending the state's existence. How often do you hear people say, we need to expand the state? We need the state to do this instead of this. And the state is defending its own power through propaganda. Now, this is going to be a little controversial. Democracy versus dictatorship. It's not as different as you would think. I know, shocking, right? A libertarian would have this. The democracy is no different than dictatorship. Well, I'm about to explain why. Now, here's a controversial Rothbard claim, and it is controversial if you don't use logic. Whether a country is a democracy or dictatorship does not fundamentally change how states behave in international politics. Look throughout history. And why does it not matter whether it's democracy or dictatorship and how it behaves in international politics? Well, here's the why. Because both systems are run by elites who control the state apparatus. We're noticing a recurring theme here. The problem with most of the modern world is the state. The difference is mainly in how the public is handled. And by handled, I mean manipulated. Dictatorships rely more on force. Democracies rely more on propaganda and consent manufacturing. That's the really neat thing. You look back when you used to have all these flyovers and everything, that was the Department of Defense paying private organizations to fund patriotism. In other words, if you want a democracy to go to war, you need a lot more speeches. Look back at going into Iraq in 2003. A lot more press conferences. Look at everything that was said. George Bush on the aircraft carrier. A lot more media messaging explaining why bombing another country is somehow the road to peace. MSNBC, Fox News. They put little different spins on it, but it's the same thing. And here's the thing. War is often great for increasing government power. Now, we can both agree on this, right and left, I'd hope, but I highly doubt it. Here's one of Rothbard's most famous observations. War is often the health of the state. Or, as Bismarck said, war is just politics by other means. Now, why is war often the health of the state, you might ask? Because war gives governments an excuse to expand power dramatically. And what does some of that power expansion look like? Well, let's start off with higher taxes. We all see that. More surveillance. Look at any bill passed after 9/11 creating DHS and anything else. More camera surveillance. More censorship. We had this in World War One, World War Two, Vietnam especially. More centralized planning. Don't build for consumers, build for war. Rothbard studied this dynamic during World War One, the first real modern war, and argued that war helped push the United States towards massive federal expansion under progressive reforms. You know, the ones that are supposed to help people out, but they actually don't. The war effort brought us price controls, no free market. The government sets the price of any goods, including wages. Industrial planning, propaganda agencies, expanded federal policing. But we don't want to talk about that. And here's the thing, those powers rarely disappear after the war ends. They very rarely do. And it's very sad that we just accept it. It's like new social programs. We just accept that they're going to come and they're never going to go away, even though they are a loss for society. We saw similar expansions during the Cold War with the growth of intelligence agencies, CIA, DIA, and national security institutions. Once government power grows in wartime, it tends to stick around like gum on your shoe. And you know, sometimes you step in dog shit and you try to scrub it off, it still smells. That's what this is, too. And here's what applies to today more so, war also distracts from domestic problems. This is another Rothbard insight from the beginning of the 20th century, still relevant today. War can help redirect the public's attention. Economic problems, yeah, it can solve those. Political scandals, on both sides we have this issue. And declining public trust, but public trust has been declining forever. Nothing rallies the public like a foreign threat. And this is why states often find it easier to wage wars against weaker or distant countries where the risk of defeat is low. That's true. That's very true. From the perspective of the state, and this is from the perspective of the state, these conflicts can expand influence without threatening survival. The US can influence other countries, Venezuela, probably Iran. But from the perspective of the taxpayer, you and me, well, guess what we get? We get invited out to dinner at a nice restaurant, get scraps, and then we get stuck with the $1 billion bill. So, what is Rothbard's big conclusion to all of this? Rothbard believed the international system is dominated by states pursuing their own power. WIIFM, what's in it for me? We all run on that, whether we want to admit it or not. Those states are run by elites. Those elites prioritize preserving the state itself, as every human does, and states are nothing more than the avatars of humans. And war often becomes a tool for expanding state power, both abroad, with dependencies and allies, and at home. But this doesn't mean that every war is identical. Sometimes states cooperate. Look at the first Gulf War, look at our invasion into Afghanistan and our invasion into Iraq, as well as Libya. Sometimes they avoid conflict. Sometimes maintain peace when war looks too risky if the cost of going to war outweighs the reward. But the underlying incentive remains the same. Governments act primarily in the interest of state apparatus, not necessarily ordinary people living under the state apparatus. Now you may ask, what is the libertarian takeaway? Because I've talked a lot. Rothbard's prescription was pretty simple, and I mean it really is simple. If you care about peace, freedom, and prosperity, these are the things you should be skeptical of, but most people won't be skeptical of them, they just accept them as fact. You should be skeptical of war, arms races, conscription, which we really don't have anymore, military intervention, which we do a lot, and the endless growth of the national security state. Because every time governments go to war, one institutionally reliably gets bigger and you can set your clock to it. And that institution that gets bigger is the state. And if Rothbard is right, the real question that we citizens need to ask ourselves is, whenever politicians start beating the drum of war, is this A? We should ask ourselves this: who actually benefits from the beating of the drums of war? And much more importantly, at least as far as I'm concerned, are you sure it's you that benefits from it? Now, thank you for watching. Please like, comment, subscribe, and share. Until next time, I'm Jeff. As always, stay free, stay informed, stay accountable. I'll see y'all next week.